What if a single piece of paper left behind at a quiet cafe held the power to change someone's entire life? A forgotten résumé, a stranger's whisper, and a connection neither of them saw coming. Before we begin, if you enjoy meaningful emotional stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing the kind of stories that touch the heart. Now, let's begin. Single dad left his résumé at a cafe. She picked it up and whispered, "I've been looking for you." The printer at Midtown Bean sputtered out the last résumé with a weak groan. Jack Monroe glanced over his shoulder nervously. The barista had stepped into the back room, leaving the espresso machine hissing like it had a secret to tell. Jack moved quickly, folding the single page and slipping it into the thin plastic sleeve already worn at the edges from overuse. His hoodie was damp from the cold drizzle outside. His jeans, once dark, were now faded and frayed at the knees. He looked like any other man grabbing coffee before work, except he wasn't. He wasn't headed to any job. Not anymore. Jack checked the time. 7:42 a.m. If he hurried, he could drop the résumé into the job board corkboard near the counter, pick up Maya from her friend's apartment, and still make it to the elementary school office by 8:30, assuming, of course, they'd let her register late again. He moved to the corner table, one that faced the street, and set the résumé bag down. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the Sharpie clipped to his keyring. On the back of the résumé beneath his name, just J. Monroe, no middle initial, no address. He scribbled a single sentence. "I build because I've lost, and I build because I still believe." He looked at it, thought of scratching it out, but something in him, the stubborn hope he hadn't managed to kill off just yet, left it there. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Ms. Donovan, the school nurse. Maya's wheezing again. Her inhaler's nearly empty. I can't keep her in class until someone signs new forms. Jack's heart kicked. He had dropped off Maya at her babysitter's last night after another shift bussing tables. He thought they had one more day before the new prescription was due. He grabbed his phone résumé forgotten on the table and bolted out the door. The plastic sleeve sat there like an unopened letter waiting for someone to read it. 5 minutes later, the bell above the cafe door jingled again. Clara Bennett stepped inside, umbrella dripping at her side. She wasn't dressed like a CEO today. No heels, no designer bag. Just a wool coat thrown over a cream sweater, jeans, and boots worn soft at the soles. She scanned the room slowly, as if seeing through its walls through time. She didn't know what had brought her back to Midtown Bean. It had been years. This had been the place she used to come at 5 a.m., before her company was even an idea. She'd written her first pitch deck here. She'd cried in the bathroom the day her business loan was denied. She'd sat by the window when the call came, telling her her brother didn't survive the overdose. Today, she wasn't sure why she was here, only that she couldn't stay away. She walked to the table by the window, the same one she always took. Her hand touched something plastic before she even sat down. A résumé. She might have tossed it aside. She saw them all the time, left behind, hopeful scraps people pinned to bulletin boards and latte cups, desperate for a chance. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the sentence scribbled across the back in black ink. The words stopped her breath. "I build because I've lost, and I build because I still believe." Her fingers trembled. 12 years ago, when she was bleeding in the back seat of her crumpled car, a stranger had knelt beside her. He had shattered the driver's window with his elbow, unlocked the door, and pulled her free as the front end began to smoke. Her leg was broken. She could barely speak. But she remembered one thing, his voice steady and low. "You survive this, then you build something good." It had been a blur. She never got his name. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. The police never found him. They called him the mechanic who vanished. But his voice had echoed in her head for years. Clara stared at the page. J. Monroe. No phone number, no email, no way to contact him. Her breath caught in her throat as if her lungs had betrayed her. She flipped the page over and scanned the resume. Technical background, engineering degree, project management experience. Nothing fancy, just solid, honest, quiet brilliance. Her mind raced. Could it be him? After all these years, her hand hovered over the resume like it was a photograph from a dream. The cafe noise faded, coffee grinders, soft jazz, the barista returning from the back, none of it registered. She picked up the resume, clutched it to her chest, and whispered, "I've been looking for you." Across the street, Jack was sprinting up the steps of the elementary school. He had no idea the life he thought he'd left behind was about to find him again. And it would begin with a sentence. A sentence he nearly erased. A sentence that would change everything. Clara stood frozen at the window of the cafe, resume still clutched to her chest as if it might vanish the moment she let go. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Buses hissed horns, blared, early commuters rushed by. But inside her, something had shifted. She sat down slowly, her knees slightly unsteady. The wooden chair creaked under her as memories she had long buried began to stir. It had been 12 years, but she remembered every breath of that day. The airbag had exploded in her face. The front of her sedan crumpled like paper against the concrete divider. She could still recall the piercing whine of twisted metal, the sting of gasoline fumes in her nostrils, the distant shouts of someone running toward her. She couldn't move her leg. Her vision was blurring the pain white-hot. Her phone had been flung into the back seat. Her hands were covered in blood. Then he came, a man in a dark hoodie, his face partly hidden, his eyes steady. He didn't panic. He didn't scream. He just crouched beside the shattered window and said, "Can you hear me?" She nodded barely. "I'm going to get you out," he said, voice calm as the world burned. He broke the glass with his elbow, ripped the seatbelt with a pocket knife, and pulled her free just before the smoke turned to flame. As he carried her away from the car, she whispered, "Why would you risk that?" And he answered, almost like it was nothing, "You survive this. Then you build something good." Back in the present, Clara blinked fast, chasing away the sting in her eyes. The paramedics had arrived seconds later. When she asked about the man, they said he was gone. A few witnesses said he'd disappeared into a side street, limping slightly. One person thought he had grease on his hands. That's all she ever knew. And yet she had built everything in her life, her company, her mission, her second chance on the scaffolding of that one sentence. Now, here it was, again. Not just the memory, the exact words, on the back of a forgotten resume. She turned it over once more. J. Monroe. No address, no number, nothing else. But there was something unmistakable in the handwriting. It wasn't the penmanship that struck her, it was the tone. Confident, but quiet, like someone who believed in the words but didn't expect anyone else to. Clara's fingers danced across her phone screen. She called Evelyn her personal assistant, someone who had been with her since the early days, someone who knew when not to ask questions. Clara said, trying to sound composed, "I need a favor. Quiet one." Always Evelyn replied instantly, "I'm going to send you a photo of a resume. I need you to find this man. Do not go through PR. No team. Just use the internal channels. Start with scholarship lists, maintenance logs, public assistance records, anything human." There was a pause. "Is he in trouble?" Evelyn asked carefully. Clara looked out the window. A father and daughter were walking by, the girl carrying a pink backpack almost as big as she was. The man held her hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. "No," Clara said. "He once saved my life. I think it's time I try to return the favor." An hour later, in a modest apartment in Queens, Jack was holding a cold compress to Maya's forehead. She was propped up on the couch, her little lungs wheezing softly despite the emergency inhaler. She looked up at him with bright, trusting eyes that had no idea how close he was to failing her. "Daddy," she asked, voice thin. "Yeah, baby. Are we still going to the school tomorrow?" Jack hesitated. He hadn't been able to submit the tuition form. Without proof of income, without insurance for her medication, he wasn't sure if they'd take her back at all. But she didn't need that right now. Of course, he said gently, brushing her hair back. We'll go first thing. He stood up, walked into the kitchen, and opened the nearly empty fridge. He counted 4 eggs, half a stick of butter, and 1 slice of bread. He exhaled, resting his hand on the counter. He needed a miracle. What he didn't know was that across town someone had already begun looking for him. That afternoon, Clara's phone buzzed with a new email from Evelyn. Subject, potential match. Maya Monroe. Clara's brow furrowed. She opened the attachment. A school newsletter entry from a year ago. A second-grade science fair. A picture of a beaming little girl beside a small hand-built wind turbine. Caption, Maya Monroe. 2nd grade and her dad. Jack Monroe built this together using recycled parts. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She zoomed in on the image. Jack's face wasn't perfectly visible. He was kneeling beside Maya, his head tilted down, but it was enough. The shape of his jaw. The way he crouched protectively beside the child. Her pulse quickened. Jack Monroe. He had a daughter now, and he was still building good things. She leaned back in her chair, tears welling in her eyes for reasons she couldn't name. All these years she had tried to live up to his words, to build something worthy of the life he had saved. But now it seemed he was the one who needed a hand. Clara opened a clean notepad on her desk. She wrote 1 line at the top of the page. How do you repay a man who never asked for anything? Then she picked up the phone. Ev, I want you to find out where he works. Quietly, no noise, no gifts, no headlines. A pause. I just want to see him, Clara said softly. I just want to thank him. The rain had turned to sleet by the time Clara's driver pulled up to the curb outside the old industrial lot in East Harlem. She didn't wait for him to open the door. Clutching her umbrella, she stepped out into the chill and stared at the building in front of her, a garage that looked like it belonged to a different decade, its brick walls stained with time, the painted sign above the bay door faded almost to white. Monroe, Auto and Electrical Est, 1987. She took a breath, trying to quiet the rush of emotion in her chest. There was something achingly humble about the place. No glass office, no polished metal letters, just grease gravel and grit, just like the man she remembered. Evelyn's report had come through just that morning. Jack Monroe, 34. Former mechanical engineer at ArcLight Systems, laid off during the economic downturn 3 years ago. No criminal record. Single father. Currently working part-time at his late father's garage doing small repairs and installations mostly for walk-in customers. Clara had read every line of the report 3 times, and yet it all felt incomplete. Jack Monroe had saved her life, then vanished like a whisper. Now, even with a name, an address, and a photo from a school science fair, she felt like she was chasing a ghost. Still, she stepped forward. Inside the garage was warm with the smell of motor oil and old metal. The rhythmic hum of an impact wrench filled the space. Clara hesitated near the entrance, unsure whether to announce herself or simply observe. Then she saw him. Bent over the hood of a battered station wagon, sleeves, rolled up hands black with grease hair, tousled eyes narrowed in concentration. He looked older than she remembered, not just in years, but in weight, the kind of heaviness that doesn't show on the scale. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back, cracking his shoulder as he rotated it. There was no doubt. It was him. Jack Monroe. She swallowed the knot in her throat. Her mind raced with a dozen possible openings. Hello. You saved my life. Sounded both insufficient and absurd. And she didn't want to startle him. Or worse, seem like a stranger imposing on a man who had clearly been through enough. So she did nothing. She stood quietly watching as he handed the keys back to an elderly customer, accepting a folded check with a quiet, "Thank you, sir," and a smile that barely reached his eyes. The kind of smile worn thin from trying to reassure others while barely holding it together yourself. The old man patted Jack's shoulder and left. Jack turned, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Clara froze. There was no flash of recognition, no flicker of memory in his gaze, just polite curiosity. She quickly looked away, pretending to examine the tools on a nearby bench. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, and even with that same calm steadiness she'd heard in a haze 12 years ago. Clara turned back to him slowly. She smiled, soft and practiced. "Hi, I'm just looking." He wiped his hands again and nodded. "Sure, just checking out the place." Something like that. She hesitated, then gestured to the car he had just finished. "You fixed that pretty fast." "Old engine. Straightforward issue," he said with a modest shrug. "Sometimes things aren't as complicated as they look." Clara couldn't help the slight smile that curved her lips. Spoken like a man who's lived through things that were. "I'm Clara," she offered. He nodded. "Jack. Just Jack. No last name, no history, no expectations." "Is this your place?" she asked. "It was my dad's. He passed a couple years back. I keep it open part-time." And the rest of the time Jack paused, eyes drifting toward the back room, mostly looking after my daughter. She's the boss, really. Clara's heart tugged. "She's lucky," she said softly. Jack looked surprised, then grateful. "Thanks. I try." There was an awkward beat of silence between them. Clara didn't know what to say next. She didn't want to scare him off. She wanted to hold on to this moment, this fragile connection to the man who had unknowingly shaped her entire life. But he was already moving, reaching for a notepad near the register. "If your car needs work, I can put you on the schedule," he said. "We're pretty flexible." She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. On the workbench beside the register, tucked beneath a clipboard, she saw it. A sketch. A child's drawing. Colorful. Crude. A stick figure man holding a wrench, and beside him a girl with wild brown curls and a cape. Above them, in messy crayon handwriting, "My dad is my superhero." Maya Clara felt something break open inside her. Not in pain, but in reverence. In awe. This man had pulled her from a burning car, spoken a single sentence that had rebuilt her life, and now he was quietly raising a daughter who saw him as her entire universe. She looked at him again. At the oil stains on his hands, the worry lines near his eyes, the tiredness in his shoulders that still couldn't dim the quiet decency in his posture. He was everything the world rarely noticed, and everything it desperately needed more of. Clara reached into her coat pocket and touched the folded resume she had brought with her, the one he had left behind. She didn't pull it out. Not yet. Not until she understood how to offer him what he truly deserved. "Actually," she said finally, her voice steady, "I was just looking today. But thank you." Jack nodded again, not pressing. As she turned to go, she paused at the doorway just long enough to glance back at him one more time. And she whispered under her breath, "I found you." Jack worked through the afternoon with his sleeves rolled up and his head down, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, just necessary. Each clang of the wrench, every engine rattle helped him quiet the storm of worries that never fully left. Bills, inhaler refills, Maya's school, the truck that still needed brake pads he couldn't afford. But something else had taken root in his thoughts today. The woman. She'd walked into his garage like she belonged there, calm, centered, observant. Her eyes weren't the kind that skimmed over things. She saw. The engine. The tools. Him. He didn't know what bothered him more, that she'd looked at him like she knew him, or that he wanted her to. Jack exhaled, rubbing his neck. Focus. There was work to finish. Maya was staying the night at her friend's house, and he had exactly 5 hours to make good use of the quiet. But Clara hadn't left either. She had driven only a block before pulling over. Now she sat in her car across the street, watching the garage through the rain-slicked windshield, her hands gripping the resume she still hadn't returned. She had rehearsed so many versions of what she might say if she saw him again. "Thank you. You saved me." You changed my life." But none of them felt right now. Not after watching the way he moved, the way he worked. She didn't want to crash into his world. She wanted to understand it first. A knock on her window startled her. She turned sharply. An older woman with wispy gray hair holding a leash connected to a lazy golden retriever smiled through the glass. Clara rolled it down. "Didn't mean to scare you," the woman said with a warm chuckle. "Just noticed you've been sitting here a while." "Everything okay?" Clara hesitated, then smiled. "Just visiting." The woman glanced across the street toward the garage. "That your boy Clara?" blinked, confused. "No, just someone I used to know." The woman's smile turned knowing. "Well, he's a good one. Jack's got the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he never lets it crush him. Fixed my car last winter. Didn't charge me a dime. Said I reminded him of someone." Clara's chest tightened. "His mama?" she asked quietly. The woman laughed. "No. His daughter," he said. "I reminded him of how stubborn she is." Clara looked at the garage again, softer now. "What's she like?" "Oh, a firecracker. Must be 6 or 7 smart. She talks about him like he hung the moon." The woman leaned in. "And he just lights up when she's around. That little girl's his whole world." Clara swallowed past the lump rising in her throat. She thanked the woman and watched her walk off with her dog, the moment folding itself neatly into Clara's heart. It was strange how Jack had saved her once with a sentence, and now, without knowing, he was doing it again. Only this time it wasn't just the words. It was how he lived them. Back inside the garage, Jack was wiping down the counter when he noticed something under the cash register that hadn't been there before. A folded note, his name scribbled in elegant handwriting across the front jack. He opened it. "12 years ago, you pulled a stranger out of a burning car. You didn't wait for thanks. You didn't leave a name. But you left a sentence that changed my life. Build something good. I did. And now I want to help you build yours. Clara." Jack stared at the note. The wrench in his hand slipped slightly, clattering to the floor. He remembered. The accident. The broken glass. Her face pale with shock. He hadn't thought about it in years, hadn't told anyone. Not even Maya. He folded the note back up, hands shaking. The next morning, the sky over the city was steel gray, but the clouds hadn't broken yet. Jack was walking Maya to school, her tiny hand tucked into his, her backpack bouncing against her side with every step. "I want to make a rocket for science fair this year," she announced between breaths. "But a real one. With fire." Jack grinned. "Let's maybe talk about safety first." She giggled, looking up at him. "You can help me right always," he said without thinking, and meant it. At the school gates, Maya turned and surprised him by hugging him extra tight. "You're the best builder ever, Daddy." He kissed the top of her head, swallowing the rush of emotion. "Go build something amazing, kiddo." She ran inside, hair bouncing, and for a moment Jack just stood there, watching, hoping the wind wouldn't blow it all away. Behind him, a voice cut through the air. "You really are the best builder, Jack." He turned. Clara stood at the corner of the schoolyard holding 2 coffees and an unreadable look in her eyes. Jack froze. He wasn't sure what he expected: awkwardness, distance, pity. But her gaze didn't hold any of that. Just recognition. And maybe a hint of admiration. You remembered he said unsure whether it was a question or a confession. Clara nodded. "I never forgot." They stood in silence for a beat that felt like a bridge built from 1,000 unspoken things. And then she stepped forward, handing him the coffee. "It's black." "I took a guess." He accepted it with a quiet thank you. They sat on the bench near the fence, the school bell echoing in the distance. "I'm not looking for anything," she said finally. "Not a story, not a savior. I just wanted you to know that your words meant something. That you meant something." Jack looked down at the lid of his cup. "I've never told anyone about that night. Not even Maya." Clara nodded. "Then let me hold it with you, just for a little while." And somehow that was more generous than anything he'd ever been offered. Jack didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake on his worn-out couch, the ceiling fan spinning slowly above him, the soft whir doing nothing to settle the thoughts flooding his mind. Clara Bennett had walked into his world again holding a memory he'd buried so deep he wasn't sure it had ever really happened. 12 years. He hadn't saved her that night expecting anything. He didn't even remember her name. He remembered the smell of smoke, the cracked windshield, the blood on her collarbone, and the way her hand gripped his sleeve like a lifeline. He remembered the ambulance sirens just as he slipped into the crowd, afraid of being pulled into something he didn't understand. His own life had already been crumbling at the edges. Now, here she was, wealthy, composed, holding coffee and words he didn't know how to process. And in the middle of all of it, a note, a memory, a quiet offer that hadn't asked anything in return. Still something about it unsettled him. Jack got up before sunrise and packed Maya's lunch. She was still curled beneath the blanket in the bedroom they shared. The space was small, the air cold near the windows, but he'd done everything he could to make it feel like home. String lights, a bookshelf made from reclaimed wood, stars painted across the ceiling. He glanced over at the table where he kept his tools and spare invoices and saw it there. The resume, folded, returned. Only it wasn't how he'd left it. He picked it up. On the front below his typed name and experience was a handwritten message in the same looping penmanship as the note from yesterday. You said you build because you've lost, but I think you build because you love, and that matters more. Jack stared at it for a long time, not because the words flattered him, but because for once they felt like someone had truly seen him. Later that day, he returned to the garage, resume in hand. The morning passed in a blur of small tasks, replacing a battery for a delivery driver on a deadline, patching a leaky radiator for a woman who paid in crumpled bills and apologetic smiles. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. Jack had always believed that dignity didn't come from a paycheck. It came from how much heart you put into what you did. He was halfway through aligning a busted axle when the door chimed. He turned, expecting another walk-in client. But it was Clara. Today, she wore a navy blazer over a gray blouse, her dark jeans tucked into boots that were practical but stylish. Her hair was swept back in a loose twist, but her expression was softer than before, like she'd left her CEO armor at home. "Is now a bad time?" she asked. Jack wiped his hands with a towel. "I've got 10 minutes before a scheduled inspection. That's as good as it gets." She smiled and stepped inside. "I brought something," she said, and handed him a plain manila folder. He raised a brow but took it, flipping it open. Inside was a printed offer, a consulting contract, temporary flexible hours, full benefits. His eyes moved over the salary line and stopped. It was more than he'd made in a year at the garage. "This is," Jack cleared his throat. "This is generous." "It's not charity," Clara said. "I'm not in the business of handing out favors. But I've been searching for someone to lead a community-based energy project. It's not just about engineering. It's about trust, about knowing how to work with people who don't want to be sold, but who do want to be seen. You've been doing that already. You just haven't had the platform." Jack leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. He studied her for a long moment. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Clara replied gently. "I know what you did when no one was watching. I know how your daughter looks at you like you hung the moon. And I know you left this resume behind not because you gave up, but because you didn't. That's the kind of builder I want." He looked down at the contract again. His mind screamed caution. This was a different world. Boardrooms, pressure, expectations, and part of him, the part that had been rejected enough times to build a permanent bruise, still didn't believe he belonged there. But then he thought of Maya, of the inhaler that would need refilling next week, of the whispered question she asked just last night. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" And now standing in front of him was a woman who didn't offer pity, but possibility. Still, he couldn't help but test her. "So, what, I sign this and suddenly I'm back in the game?" Clara shook her head. "No. You sign this, and you keep doing what you're already doing. But this time with resources, with a team, with support. Jack ran a hand through his hair. The silence between them stretched not uncomfortable, just uncertain. Finally, he set the folder down and met her eyes. "I don't want to be anyone's second-chance mascot," he said quietly. "I've spent years learning how to survive with less. I can't afford to owe anyone anything." Clara didn't flinch. "Then, don't owe me," she said. "Build something good. That'll be enough." Jack didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either, and Clara, sensing the line he was towing, offered him the most respectful thing she could space. "I'll leave this with you," she said, tapping the folder. "No pressure, no expiration date." She turned to go, then paused at the door. "You know, I used to think the man who saved me was a stranger I'd never see again," she said without turning back. "But it turns out he's still saving people. Every single day. Especially the one who calls him Dad." Then she walked out. Jack stood in the garage, Résumé in one hand, contract in the other. For the first time in years, the weight in his chest began to shift just a little. Not lifted, but moving. Like maybe it was making room for something better. The conference room was glass-walled and bathed in warm morning light, its sleek table polished to a faultless shine. Clara sat at the far end, her fingers laced loosely under her chin, trying to look calm, but failing to ignore the quiet flutter behind her ribs. Across from her, three of her team members waited: Kenny from HR, Malik from Community Partnerships, and Jenna, her ever-perceptive Director of Engineering. They were all sharp, loyal, and more importantly curious. But none of them knew what this introductory meeting was really about. To them, Jack Monroe was just a community mechanic with potential. A courtesy meeting Clara had requested, no doubt part of one of her city outreach initiatives. No big deal, just another pitch. But to her, this wasn't a pitch. It was a test. Not for Jack, but for the world around him. Would they see what she saw? Or would they miss it the way so many people had missed the quiet men who held everything together without asking to be noticed? The elevator dinged. Her heart leapt before she could stop it. Jack stepped out alone, wearing his only collared shirt, a soft blue one that had clearly been pressed carefully by hand. His boots were clean, but still scuffed, his jeans too faded to be new, but far too honest to replace. His hair was combed back, and in his hand was a leather folder visibly worn at the corners. He looked at her through the glass, hesitant but steady. Clara stood to greet him, her smile warm. "Jack, I'm glad you came." He gave her a quick nod, glancing at the others. Seemed like the kind of invite that's hard to ignore. "Come in," she said, gesturing toward the table. He entered like a man walking into a trap he hadn't quite identified yet. Polite, alert, guarded. Kenny stood and offered a hand. "Jack Monroe, right heard good things. Let's have a seat." They all settled in. Jack sat stiffly, folder on the table, hands clasped tightly around it. Jenna broke the silence first. "Jack, we've reviewed the proposal Clara sent over. The concept for decentralized solar retrofits on older apartment units is sharp. I'm curious where'd that idea come from?" Jack blinked. "Honestly, from a neighbor who couldn't afford her heating bill last winter. I figured if we could tap small systems, even 50 watts a window, it might be enough to keep her warm at night." Malik leaned forward, intrigued. "You built a prototype?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, out of salvage panels and an inverter from a junked RV. It worked. Wasn't pretty, but it worked." Kenny raised an eyebrow. "You've worked in R&D before." Jack hesitated. "I was at ArcLight for about 6 years. Process design, failure testing, until the layoffs hit." "And since then?" Jenna asked. Jack looked at her evenly. "Since then, I've fixed old trucks, rebuilt washing machines, built toys out of scrap with my daughter. It's not impressive, but it's real." There was a pause. It wasn't defensive, it was just the truth. Clara watched the room closely. Malik scribbled something down. Jenna gave a subtle nod. But Kenny frowned slightly. And you think that qualifies you to lead a pilot with a budget in 6 figures? Jack sat back, finally exhaling. I didn't ask to lead anything. I came because Clara said she believed in something I'd done. But if this is just a test I meant to pass, I think we can save each other time. He stood calmly but with finality. Clara's breath caught. Jack. He turned to her, not angry, not cold, just honest. I don't know what I walked into here, but I've already done the whole prove your worth routine. I've done it in courtrooms and school offices and back alley interviews where I pretended the holes in my boots were fashion. His voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable weight. I'm not ashamed of where I am, but I won't beg to matter in rooms that can't see beyond a resume. The room fell silent. Even Kenny looked down. Clara stood slowly, her voice measured. That's not what this was. Jack gave her a look that said he wasn't so sure. Clara walked around the table, standing in front of him. You're right, she said. This room doesn't decide your worth. I asked you here because we hoped that you'd let us partner with you. Not lead. Partner. She glanced at her team. Because the future we're building doesn't need another polished pitchman. It needs someone who's lived the problem and kept showing up anyway. Jack's shoulders loosened slightly. Jenna stood too. I'd follow a guy who can rebuild dignity out of busted solar panels. And if he doesn't want to lead, that's fine. But I want him in the room. Malik grinned. Same here. Kenny cleared his throat. Well, I suppose I've been appropriately outvoted. Jack looked at them all, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't bracing for judgment. He was being invited to build. He looked at Clara. I need to be home by 3, he said. My daughter has an art project. I promised I'd help. Clara smiled. Then we'll work around that. Jack gave a half smile, the first real one Clara had seen. He sat back down, and this time it wasn't as a guest. The kitchen clock ticked quietly above the sink, marking 9:17 p.m. Jack stood barefoot in the narrow hallway of his apartment, a dish towel still slung over his shoulder, staring at the closed door to Maya's room. She had fallen asleep 30 minutes earlier, mid-sentence, her tiny body curled up beneath the hand-painted stars on the ceiling. Her inhaler sat beside her pillow. She had used it once tonight, then insisted she was just fine and that he needed to go do something big for once. He'd laughed, softly, but the words had lingered long after her breathing evened out. He turned away, now walked into the kitchen and opened the manila folder that had been sitting unopened since he got home. The contract was still there, his name typed cleanly across the top, Jack Monroe, lead consultant, community-based engineering initiative. His resume was attached underneath Clara's handwritten note, still visible on the back of the copy she'd returned to him. You build because you love. He read the line again and again, and again. Not because he didn't understand it, but because a part of him didn't quite believe anyone else had. He hadn't meant to walk out of that meeting earlier. Not really. It had just been instinct, an old reflex from too many rooms where he'd had to shrink to fit. Too many jobs that called him overqualified as a way to avoid hiring a single dad. Too many polite rejections with silent judgments behind them. But today was different. Today he had stood up, and they didn't look away. They had listened. That, in itself, felt bigger than the paycheck. He reached for his phone and opened the photo gallery. A shot of Maya holding her science fair wind turbine. Another of her painting cardboard stars for her ceiling. One of her asleep, clutching her stuffed giraffe cheeks flushed with dreams. Jack set the phone down, rubbed his eyes, and looked toward the apartment door. And then, before he had time to overthink it, he grabbed his hoodie and walked out. Clara hadn't expected the knock. She had been curled up on her reading chair in her loft apartment, barefoot hair, loose, a mug of tea going cold on the end table beside her. Her laptop sat on the armrest, still open to a page titled, Why We Build. It was a speech she'd been asked to give at a nonprofit summit next week about innovation and compassion in infrastructure. She'd stared at the blank document for hours, typing and deleting over and over. Because for the first time in her career, she didn't want to talk about strategy. She wanted to talk about people. The knock came again, firm but not demanding. She stood cautiously walking to the door, looked through the peephole. Jack. She opened the door slowly. He stood there, hands in his hoodie pockets, eyes tired but alert. "Did I wake you?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I just didn't expect. I didn't know where else to go," he said. "Or maybe I didn't want to go anywhere else." She stepped back wordlessly, letting him in. He didn't sit, just stood in the middle of her living room looking like a man trying to solve an equation with no known variables. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said finally. "That job. It's more than I've had in years. It's more than I thought I deserved." "You do deserve it," Clara said gently but firmly. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. "I keep thinking," he continued, "what if I mess it up? What if I take it and then fail? And Maya sees that. What if the only thing I'm good at is holding things together just enough to not fall apart?" Clara stepped closer. "Jack, do you think I've never asked myself the same thing? That I've never doubted whether I'm leading something worth following? Every morning I wake up wondering if I'm one choice away from breaking something I built." He looked at her, startled. "You," she smiled. "Me? Every version of success has a cost. But the only thing worse than failing is never showing up." He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, dense but not empty. Then Clara moved toward her desk and pulled open a drawer. She returned with a worn book, The Bridge Builder, a poetry collection her late father had given her when she started the company. She handed it to Jack, her fingers brushing his. "Page 73, she said. He opened it slowly, read silently, then read again aloud. He crossed the chasm deep and wide, but built a bridge for those who tried. Though he would not return that way, he built for others day by day. He looked up. His voice had cracked near the end. "Clara? Why me?" She didn't answer right away, just studied him for a long, quiet moment. "Because," she said finally, "you never needed a title to start building, and because people like you make the rest of us remember why it all matters." Jack inhaled deeply, and something broke inside him, not in pain, but in surrender. Not to failure, but to hope, to the terrifying, beautiful idea that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't reached the end of the road, but the beginning of something he never thought he'd find again. A second chance. Later that night, he stood outside Clara's apartment door again, hand on the knob, hesitating. She had offered him the guest room, said it was late and the trains were slow. But Jack had politely declined. He needed to go home, to sleep in his own space, to breathe in the scent of his daughter's shampoo and feel the weight of the life he'd built with his bare hands. Before he left, Clara had handed him back the contract. Not with pressure, just belief. "Take your time," she'd said. "I'll be here." And as the city pulsed gently around him, Jack finally allowed himself to believe it too. Sunday morning broke over Queens with the kind of golden light that felt borrowed, soft, rare, and entirely too beautiful to last. Jack stood at the kitchen counter flipping pancakes while Maya sat at the small table nearby, humming off-key to a song only she seemed to know. She was wearing one of his old T-shirts as a dress, her hair a wild halo of curls and her face still flushed from sleep. He watched her out of the corner of his eye and thought not for the first time that she was the only thing he'd ever done perfectly. "Is it true?" Maya asked suddenly. Jack blinked. "Is what true? That you got offered a real job? Like a grown-up job? Not fixing Mrs. Hampton's lawnmower?" He chuckled. "Where did you hear that?" She pointed her fork at him with a very serious face. "I have ears, Daddy. And Miss Clara called last night while you were in the shower." Jack raised a brow. "She called you?" Maya grinned proudly. "She said I was her favorite assistant." He shook his head, flipping the pancake. "Traitor." She said you could help people and make stuff, Maya added. Isn't that what superheroes do? Jack went still for half a second, then quietly slid the finished pancakes onto her plate. Eat your breakfast. But his hand trembled just slightly as he set down the syrup bottle. Later that day, after dropping Maya off at her friend's house for a movie night, Jack found himself on the train to Manhattan, the contract folded in his coat pocket like a loaded question. Clara had given him a choice. No timeline, no strings, just possibility. But Jack wasn't a man who did things lightly. If he was going to say yes, it would be because he believed not just in her, but in himself. He arrived at the rooftop garden of her company's downtown headquarters just before sunset. Clara was already there watering the rosemary bushes in terracotta pots lining the edge of the glass wall. She looked serene, purposeful. She glanced up as he approached. Hey, he held up the manila folder. You left this in my hands. I figured it was time I gave you an answer. Clara nodded slowly, brushing dirt from her hands onto a towel. Do I need to brace myself? Jack exhaled. No, but maybe sit down. They moved to the bench under a lattice of ivy. The city stretched out below them, buildings glowing orange, the river glinting in the distance, the world caught between day and night. I want to say yes, Jack began. But only if we're clear on what I'm actually saying yes to. Clara leaned in listening. I'm not coming in to polish reports or spin numbers to sound nice. I'm not dressing things up for investors who've never set foot in a broken elevator. If I do this, I want to build things that matter to people who've never had a seat at the table. Clara didn't interrupt. Her gaze held his unblinking. I want a team that includes the people who've been ignored, mothers with no childcare, veterans with outdated skills, kids who aged out of the system and got left behind. I want to train them, listen to them, hire them. You want to rewrite how we build, Clara said quietly. Jack nodded. From the ground up. A pause. Then she smiled. Good, because that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. He blinked. Seriously, I don't need another boardroom strategist, Jack. I've got 30 of them. I need someone who remembers why we started this in the first place. She opened her phone and pulled up a photo, an old one. A burned-out building with graffiti scrawled across the crumbling walls, a small solar array hastily mounted to the side. This was the first project we did. 5 panels, 1 generator, 2 volunteers. We powered the emergency lights in a shelter that had gone dark for 3 weeks. Jack studied the image. That's yours, she nodded. Before the logo. Before the company. Just me, a borrowed ladder, and a dream no bank would touch. He smiled, and it surprised them both. You know, he said you don't talk like a CEO. I try not to, she replied. I'm too busy trying to be useful. Another silence passed between them. Not awkward, just full. I have one condition, Jack said. Clara raised a brow. If I do this, it's not just for a job. It's for my daughter. I want her to see me build something real. I want her to come to my work one day and point at a project and say my dad did that. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. Then we'll make sure she can. He took a breath and unfolded the contract. Signed it, handed it to her. Clara didn't rush to read it. She simply accepted it like the sacred thing it was. A choice, a step forward, a deal between 2 people who had nothing to prove except that kindness and integrity could still build something that lasted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in deep gold, Jack stood. So, when do we start? Clara smiled. We already have. Back at home, Maya was waiting on the couch, fighting sleep with every stubborn ounce in her small body. Jack sat beside her, still wearing his coat, and she crawled into his lap without a word. You got the job, she murmured. He kissed her temple. Yeah, baby, I got the job. And are we going to be okay? Jack looked around their little apartment. Still small, still a little drafty. But somehow in that moment it felt full. He held her tighter. "We're gonna be more than okay," he said. "We're gonna build something beautiful." The sun was barely up when Jack arrived at the new project site, an aging apartment complex in the South Bronx that Clara's company had recently partnered with the city to restore. The place had seen better days: chipped paint, rusted mailboxes, a flickering hallway light that buzzed like it had been trying to die for years. But Jack didn't flinch. He didn't see the building's decay. He saw its bones. He saw potential. Clara met him at the gate holding 2 travel mugs and already dressed for work. She handed him one without a word. Jack took it with a quiet nod, the warmth spreading through his fingers. For a moment they just stood side by side watching the city wake up. "You ready?" she asked. "I've been ready," Jack said. "I just didn't know someone would actually open the door." Clara smiled. "Well, you kicked mine open 12 years ago, so I owed you." He looked over at her, his voice soft. "You don't owe me anything." She met his gaze. "That's why it works." Inside, a small team was already gathering, half from Clara's company, half from the community. Jack recognized the look in the eyes of the locals, cautious optimism mixed with hard-earned skepticism. He knew that expression intimately. It was the look of people who had learned not to expect too much because disappointment always came cheap. Jack introduced himself without titles. No consultant, no project lead. Just, "Hi, I'm Jack. I'm here to help build something real with you." That was it. And somehow it worked. By noon, the energy around the site had shifted. Tools clanged. Ladders scraped against brick. The first solar mounts were measured and prepped. Clara watched from the background as Jack moved between groups, translating technical instructions into plain language, listening twice as much as he spoke. He noticed things no one else did. A resident named Luis, barely 20, had stayed quiet through the morning. Jack invited him to help stabilize the panel mount. "You've got good balance," he said casually, pointing at the way Luis adjusted scaffolding with his foot. "Used to skateboard." Luis blinked. "How'd you know?" "Because that's the same stance I had when I broke my wrist at 14. Luis cracked a grin. And, just like that, the wall came down. By the end of the day, Luis was leading the drill work, surrounded by neighbors watching in awe. Later that week, Jenna, the director of engineering, paid a visit to the site. Clara had asked her to stop by not for a formal review, but because she wanted Jenna to see what couldn't be measured in progress reports. Jack didn't notice her right away. He was helping an elderly woman with her windowsill, explaining how the insulation upgrade would reduce her winter heating bill. Jenna watched him work, her expression slowly changing from clinical to something resembling wonder. When he finally noticed her, Jack stood and offered a friendly nod. "Didn't expect a suit today." Jenna chuckled. "Didn't expect to be impressed so fast." He shrugged, brushing dust off his hands. "People will do incredible things if you stop talking at them and start building with them." She smiled, arms crossed. "Clara told me you were good. She didn't say you'd rewrite the whole playbook." Jack looked down at his work. "I'm not trying to change the system. Just trying to make sure people who look like me don't get left behind." Jenna paused. "You ever think about taking this citywide?" Jack blinked. "Excuse me, you're training people. You're stabilizing infrastructure. You're building more than solar units, Jack. You're building trust." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm just trying to make sure my daughter grows up in a world where her dad did something that mattered." Jenna tilted her head. "I think she already is." That night, Jack picked Maya up from her art club, her backpack bouncing against her legs as she skipped beside him. "Guess what?" she said, eyes bright. "What I told Ms. Harper I was going to build a floating garden one day, like on a roof, with tomatoes and bees and everything." Jack smiled. "That's a pretty good plan." She said, "That sounds like something my dad would do." He paused, heart catching slightly. "What did you say?" Maya looked up at him with absolute certainty. "I said he already does." At home, Jack flipped through a binder Clara had given him earlier that week. It contained letters, handwritten, typed, scribbled on napkins from residents they'd helped across the city. Some were simple. Thank you for helping us breathe better. Others were raw. We'd given up on anyone caring. You changed that. At the very back, one letter was dated the day before. From Luis. I didn't think I was worth much. Nobody ever asked me to build anything. You asked, so I did. Now I want to ask someone else. Jack closed the binder, his throat tight. It wasn't just a job. It never had been. It was proof that people who are quietly holding the world together finally had the tools and the voice to build it better. Clara showed up at the garage 2 days later. Jack was finishing some repair work on a neighbor's scooter. She waited, patiently leaning against the doorframe, watching him. I thought you had people to do that now, she teased. Jack shrugged. Some things you do because it reminds you where you came from. She stepped forward, holding out something wrapped in linen cloth. He opened it slowly. It was his old resume, creased-worn but now framed. Under the glass, she had written, "This wasn't a job application. It was a map." Jack looked at her speechless. Clara smiled. Turns out it led us here. The first autumn chill crept through the windows of Jack's apartment as he stood in the hallway buttoning Maya's coat with careful precision. Outside, the wind rattled dry leaves along the sidewalk, whispering promises of change. Maya looked up at him with that same blend of curiosity and certainty that always undid him. "Daddy, can I come to work with you today?" Jack hesitated. Her cheeks were still flushed from last week's bout of asthma. He'd almost said no out of habit, out of fear. But today wasn't like before. Today was different. He crouched to her level. "Only if you promise not to climb any ladders or start any solar fires." She grinned. Deal. The site buzzed with activity as they arrived, ladders scraping drills, humming conversations overlapping in English and Spanish. Jack helped Maya into a little hard hat someone had labeled Chief Creative Consultant in marker. She beamed. Clara was already there, walking the perimeter with a tablet in hand and a scarf tied loosely around her neck. She glanced up as Maya ran toward her and knelt to greet her with a warm hug. "I've been waiting for my consultant," Clara said, rising with a wink at Jack. "She demanded cookies in her rider," he muttered. "She'll fit right in." They shared a look easy familiar now, the kind of gaze born not from declarations but from shared purpose long hours and the quiet folding of two lives that had once run parallel but were now moving toward something else entirely. Mid-morning, the crew gathered on the rooftop for the official reveal of Jack's pilot design, a low-cost modular solar system tailored for multifamily units. It was efficient, scalable, and most importantly, community-built. Luis stood beside Jack, arms crossed, trying to look serious and failing. "We really did it," he whispered. Jack nodded. "Yeah." "We did." Clara stepped forward with a small microphone, speaking to the press and local leaders gathered on the rooftop. Her voice was poised, confident, but more relaxed than usual. She wasn't performing today. She was celebrating. "I could give you numbers," she said, "but this project isn't about numbers. It's about faces, families, futures, and it's about people who never stopped building quietly, steadily, even when the world forgot to look." She turned slightly toward Jack without saying his name, and yet everyone felt it. That night, Maya fell asleep in the car on the ride home, her cheek pressed against her seatbelt, a crayon drawing of a solar panel clutched in her hand. Jack carried her inside, tucked her into bed, then returned to the living room and sank into the couch with a tired sigh. Clara was already waiting there, having dropped by with dinner from the Thai place they both liked but always pretended they didn't crave. She watched him in silence as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. "You okay?" she asked softly. Jack nodded without looking up. "Yeah, just full." Of what he lifted his head, eyes bright. "Everything I never thought I'd feel again." Clara walked over and sat beside him. "You were extraordinary today. I was terrified. That's what made it honest." He exhaled a laugh. "I still feel like I'm making it all up as I go." "Then you're in good company." They sat together, their shoulders touching lightly, the quiet between them no longer a void, but a resting place. Jack looked over at her. Do you remember what you told me the first time we talked again? Clara smiled. Which time? When you returned my resume. She thought for a moment. You build because you love. He nodded. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I thought it sounded like a compliment. And now I know it was a mirror. He reached for the framed resume she had returned, which sat on the bookshelf beside Maya's Paper Star mobiles. He held it for a second, then turned it to her. I want this to hang in the new community center. Clara blinked. Jack. Not for me, he said. For the kids coming after us. I want them to see that even something forgotten on a coffee shop table can change everything. She took the frame gently from his hands, her expression soft. Then we'll hang it there, she said. Right above the doorway. Jack looked at her. You realize we've become one of those stories, right? The ones no one believes until they hear it from someone else. She smiled. Then maybe it's time we start telling it. A week later, the team gathered in the nearly finished multi-purpose room of the community center, sunlight pouring through the new skylights Jack had designed, the air filled with fresh paint and possibility. Children ran between cardboard boxes. Grandparents sipped coffee and watched with quiet hope. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shook hands. And in the front foyer, framed under a soft spotlight, hung Jack's resume. Beneath it, a small plaque read, Sometimes the thing you leave behind becomes the very thing that finds you. As people filed in, Maya tugged Clara's sleeve. Ms. Clara, can I show you something? Clara leaned down. Of course. Maya led her to a bulletin board covered in hand-drawn notes. On one, written in red crayon, were the words, When I grow up, I want to be like my dad, because he builds things that make people believe again. Clara stared at it, her heart catching. She turned, found Jack standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her with quiet intensity. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. She walked over, closed the space between them, and reached for his hand. And for the first time, not as colleagues, not as ghosts of a shared past, but as two people who had fought their way into each other's lives, they stood together and let the world settle into place around them. Sunday afternoon sunlight poured through the wide windows of Jack's new kitchen like a quiet blessing. The modest apartment in Harlem still smelled faintly of fresh paint and warm maple cabinets, nothing fancy but everything real. There was space now. Light. Air. A proper table where 3 people could sit without bumping elbows. And on that table a wooden sign Maya had painted herself sat in a stand made from recycled copper wire, We build together. Jack stood at the stove, wearing a flour-dusted apron, flipping grilled cheese sandwiches with the kind of care most people reserved for fine art. His hand moved with practiced ease, but his thoughts drifted. It had been 6 months since he signed the contract. 6 months since his life had stopped surviving and started living. The community project had expanded faster than anyone predicted. News outlets picked it up. Other neighborhoods wrote in requesting guidance. He'd given talks nervously then, confidently about how renewable energy wasn't just an environmental issue but a human one. His team had grown to include single moms, retired electricians, first-generation college students, and even Luis, who was now leading apprenticeships in East Brooklyn. And through it all, Clara had been there not as a distant CEO but as a partner. Present, grounded, vulnerable in ways Jack hadn't imagined when he first saw her again at the café. Sometimes they met at the office, sometimes on rooftops, but more and more often, they met here. Maya peeked around the corner from her room holding something behind her back. You can't come in yet, she declared. Jack raised an eyebrow. You said that 5 minutes ago. It's a surprise. He held up both hands. I'll stay out. Clara laughed from her place at the kitchen island, peeling an orange with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, but never like this, never here. She's been rehearsing for a week, she said under her breath. She gets that from your side, Jack teased. Clara smiled, warmth rising in her chest. It had been slow the way their lives had folded into each other, no declarations, No rushed confessions. Just long conversations, quiet dinners the way Jack reached instinctively for her hand when no one was looking. It had all come without fireworks and yet somehow felt like the most extraordinary thing she'd ever known. The timer beeped. Jack plated the sandwiches and soup, his Sunday special as Maya called it, and placed everything on the table. A minute later, Maya burst into the room with her hands behind her back, beaming with an energy too big for her small frame. "I made something," she announced. Clara leaned forward. "What is it?" Maya stepped between them and revealed a sketch drawn with marker and watercolor. 3 people sat side by side at a table. One tall man with big hands, one woman with curly hair tied in a scarf, and a little girl with star-shaped clips in her pigtails. Above them, in red crayon letters, it read, "My family, Jack's breath caught." Clara blinked fast, but the tears still won. "You like it?" Maya asked. Jack swallowed, voice low. "I love it." Clara knelt down, placing a hand on Maya's cheek. "You're the best artist I know." Maya beamed and hugged them both tight, fierce, as if she knew what she had drawn was already real and had been for some time. They sat down together just as the wind outside turned leaves into a dance. And they ate, talked, laughed. No spotlights, no speeches. Just a man who once left his resume on a cafe table, a woman who never forgot a voice that pulled her from the wreckage, and a little girl who drew a picture of a family before anyone had even said the word out loud. Later that evening, Jack stood by the window with a mug of tea, Maya already asleep down the hall. Clara joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head on his shoulder. "She's happy," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "So are you." Jack didn't respond right away. He looked out at the lights of the city, the ones he used to chase then avoid, and now finally understood. Not because they were bright, but because they were constant. "I used to think I'd missed my shot," he murmured, "that my best work was behind me. That kindness was something you gave until you couldn't afford to anymore." Clara's arms tightened around him. But now he continued. "I see that sometimes the best things we build don't come from plans or blueprints. They come from the pieces we thought we'd lost." She turned his face gently toward hers. "You didn't lose them, Jack. You just needed someone to help you see where they belonged." He kissed her then, not urgently, not as a beginning, but as a promise already made. Weeks later, at the grand opening of the second community hub, Maya was invited to cut the ribbon. She wore her best dress and sparkly sneakers and gave a speech that made local reporters tear up. Clara stood beside Jack as cameras flashed and whispered, "She's going to change the world." Jack nodded. "She already has." Behind them, above the entrance, hung the framed resume that had started it all. Below it, etched into bronze, were the words, "Sometimes the thing we leave behind becomes the thing that finds us and teaches us how to begin again." We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Tell us in the comments and share how this story made you feel. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional and inspiring stories that celebrate kindness, hope, and the human spirit. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We appreciate you more than you know.